This video is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one website platform for entrepreneurs to stand out and succeed online. When people hit you with the question, who are the greatest filmmakers working today, it's hard not to think of Denis Villeneuve, unless you're the Academy, in which case I guess he just doesn't exist. Villeneuve is a French-Canadian filmmaker who has, believe it or not, been at it since the late 90s, but it wasn't until the 2010s that his vision really started to blossom and his name started popping up more often. What I find particularly interesting about Villeneuve compared to a lot of other filmmakers I've done ranked videos for is he doesn't have a singular hit, a film most people can agree is his best. His style is consistently sophisticated and grand, but he has a tremendous sense of heart at the center of all his films, and I love asking friends which film of his is their favorite because it's always something different. Some people like sci-fi Denis, others like crime Denis, a small, very odd group of folks might like talking fish Denis, and when you love a Villeneuve film, it's for reasons that cut deep, that you get passionate about. It's what makes him such an interesting filmmaker, in my eyes. But anyway, in light of being completely shut out of the awards conversation this year for reasons I can't wrap my head around, I thought now was a good time to dive into his filmography and rank his work from least favorite to modern classic. It goes a lot deeper than you might think, and hopefully in the process we'll have a better understanding of who he is as an artist. As is the case most of the time with these lists, Villeneuve's weakest film happens to be his first, August 32nd on Earth, which says a lot as there's still a bunch to it the very least appreciate about this. August 32nd follows a young model named Simone. After surviving a car crash, she decides she needs to have a baby, very suddenly. She asks her close, not single friend Philippe to help her make the child, to which he reluctantly agrees, but only if they can do it in the desert. Yeah, on paper, this is a pretty ridiculous movie, and for a debut feature, Villeneuve already has a lot of personality, even if it's borrowed from other filmmakers. This is clearly very influenced by the French New Wave. The whole thing has the rowdy, energetic attitude of the French New Wave films, as well as the liberating feel that a lot of independent films from the 90s had. There's like a tiny bit of Tarantino in this. If anything else, you can feel it through the screen that the director is hungry and passionate about his craft, a passion you can still see in Villeneuve's work today. He directs with a sort of purposefulness as if it's the last film he'll get to make, which, knowing how weird this was, that could have been a possibility. The film premiered at the Cannes Film Festival in the Uncertain Regard section, winning Alexis Martin the Prix Jutra for Best Actor. These first-time filmmaker traits also make themselves known in a less favorable sense. While I can recognize Villeneuve's signature traits like his themes of birth, motherhood, and his way of capturing barren landscapes, this does mostly read like a hodgepodge of ideas, loosely tied together in a plot that feels built for a short. It just gets a little boring after a while, is what I'm trying to say. And for those reasons, I couldn't really put this any higher than last place, but it says a lot that I still wouldn't call his weakest film a bad movie. Polytechnique, Villeneuve's shortest feature film, and you could call it his comeback film, is a retelling of the 1989 Montreal massacre where a shooter murdered a group of feminists at the École Polytechnique. When you look at Villeneuve's filmography, Polytechnique is the first film where you can pretty clearly see the directorial trademarks that we associate with him today start to come alive. There's a lot of attention towards cinematography, atmosphere, and simplicity, a sort of restraint that just wasn't there in Maelstrom or August 32nd. Watching Polytechnique, you get the sense that this director could handle something a lot bigger. He can make tiny rooms, and the conversations within those rooms feel larger than life. Technically speaking, it's delicate and sterile, an appropriate choice for a subject as grim and as tragic as this. The film was, and still is, a bit of a controversial one, unsurprisingly so given the subject matter, and it's also hard not to think about Gus Van Sant's Elephant during this, one of the only other films I can think of brave enough to tackle this subject. But unlike Elephant, which aims to leave you feeling hollowed out and distressed, Polytechnique attempts to dive into the psyche of the characters a bit more, specifically the shooter. In this story specifically, he intentionally steps away from the perspective of the women, and even if it is intentional, even if it has purpose, I did feel incredibly disconnected. There is a sense of optimism in the end, that we can make a better future for ourselves, rebuild from this tragedy, but the solution reads like women need to raise better men. To accuse Denis of thinking that the solution to misogyny is for women to do a better job is a stretch for sure. His heart's in the right place here, and I don't think he earnestly believes that, but that is kinda how the ending felt to me. These are the kinds of conclusions you arrive at when a filmmaker doesn't go deep enough. It makes you wonder if this film needed to exist in the first place. It may start a dialogue, it may bring light to the situation, it certainly did for me. These are all things you can certainly say about Van Sant's Elephant as well, but that film at the very least captured the complete emptiness of the situation, a new way of understanding the horrors of it. Polytechnique is a pretty good dramatization of the event. It's ambitious and handsomely directed. It's certainly an excellent example of how Denis can use a camera, but its lack of understanding for the victims of the story leaves me with a questionable taste in my mouth and not a whole lot else. Without a doubt, Denis' quirkiest film, Maelstrom tells the story of a woman named Bibiane who kills a man in a hit and run while driving under the influence, and the constant guilt and paranoia she faces after the fact. It's also narrated by a talking fish. That's the quirky part, I should have led with that. Maelstrom was his follow-up to August 32nd, and also centers around a car crash. One of his main intentions with the film, though, was blending these fantasy-like elements like the fish with bleak realism. Even if this is kind of an absurd example of that blend, it's a connection he's still fascinated in these days. One you could say he's even mastered. And though this is one of the earliest examples of him attempting that mix, that doesn't necessarily mean it's one of the best. Maelstrom is a deeply frustrating film, if you can't tell. There's a lot I admired about this and a lot that didn't work at all. The fish is fun and weird, but it's so separate from the central narrative that it's just a bit jarring anytime it shows up, and in the process it dilutes what we had just seen in the more serious scenes. The film ends on a gag, a final punchline. I used to call Denis humorless. Clearly I was wrong. To be fair, in a BFI interview, he mentions that he was extremely influenced by Leos Carax at the time, and after learning that, I can totally see what he's trying to do here. But what this boils down to is a pretty serious and compelling drama about grief and regret stuck inside a quirky film with a talking fish that doesn't entirely land on its feet. Nothing wrong with that. It's interesting, and the connection between the fish and Bibiane almost works. There's too many motifs in this thing to list off, but neither tones are able to fully flourish here, especially compared to the rest of what's on this list. Enemy is about a college professor who one day discovers another man who looks exactly like him, and what happens when he discovers that that guy is a real bad boy. The film stars Jake Gyllenhaal, obviously as both men, and this is the first film that really feels like the Denis we know today. The surrealism, the atmosphere, the mindfuckery, the open-ended finale, these are all traits that Denis has gotten very good at, and it's the first time he really nails the tones and themes he's wanted to tackle. The first thing you'll probably realize about Enemy is that it's all yellow. It's probably the most yellow film I've ever seen. Like literally the consistency of a black and white film, but instead of black and white, it's black and yellow. And I can't think of a lot of films to commit to a color like this. And it works. The yellow gives it this queasy feeling. Nothing feels right. It's almost apocalyptic. It's one of the best examples of Denis using seemingly simple techniques to achieve a sort of world building. Jake Gyllenhaal is delivering a bone-chilling performance in this. I wish they would relink on something post-Dune, because his acting style complements Villeneuve's direction really well. Enemy is a simple film on the surface, but a deeply philosophical one the more you chew on it. It personifies the darker version of our main character and brings those conflicting identities to life in a pretty quiet and unsettling way, culminating in an ending that I won't spoil, but shook me to my core on a first watch. It's one of the gentlest jump scares I've ever seen in a film, and it's the fact that it's so sudden and casual that makes it really frightening. Like any great piece of surrealism, you could interpret the ending in a number of ways. To me, it's a symbol of this evil inside of him, the creature being cursed with committing violence as a means of survival. And even without the details and logistics that connect this specific creature to his actions, I find the image itself to be very effective. It's incredibly unsettling. It's one of Villeneuve's simplest films, at least on the surface. The cast is small, the runtime is short, the style is limited, there's only one color, and that's probably why I couldn't put it any higher than these next few. But it also goes to show how much Denis can say without needing to say a whole lot. Prisoners follows a detective as he tracks down whoever kidnapped a local man's daughter. It's both Villeneuve's first fully English language film and his first of 3 collaborations with cinematographer Roger Deakins, which feels like one of the most noteworthy things to mention, as this thing is drop-dead gorgeous. I would go as far to say this is some of Deakins' finest work. The use of rain is particularly stunning here, very textured cinematography all the way through. It's also his first of many collaborations with composer Johan Johansson. It was a turning point for him, is what I'm trying to say. day. Not to mention it also happened to be his first major hit, ranking #1 at the box office and officially putting him on the mainstream map. I love it when Denis dips his toes into the crime genre. His approach feels very influenced by Kiyoshi Kurosawa's Cure, where there's a real psychological element to his direction. It creeps into your head and goes beyond the cut and dry formula this genre is used to. There's also naturally a lot of Fincher influence, specifically from Zodiac. That's probably just the Gyllenhaal of it all, though. Which, speaking of, if this is Denis' best film in any way, it might just be in the performances. Denis' films are often, not all the time, so atmospheric and captivating that performances don't need to do that much. Gyllenhaal, for example, plays a pretty subdued performance for most of Enemy, and it works well, but in Prisoners, the life and soul of this thing comes alive through the performances, through Hugh Jackman's rage, Dano's squeamishness, Gyllenhaal's attentiveness. There are passive performances that work to draw attention to atmosphere, and then there are performances where every other piece of filmmaking is working for that, and none of these actors miss a beat in Prisoners. Funny enough, Timothée Chalamet all the way back in 2013 auditioned for this film. That could have been fun. When I look out at this list of films, I have to admit I have a hard time putting to words what Prisoners represents in Villeneuve's filmography, other than his first mainstream English language hit. There's a case to be made that it's one of his most finely crafted films, a near flawless piece of filmmaking where the sound, image, performance, and writing are all working harmoniously together, which they are. Aside from being a little too sterile, which I know that's the point, I can't really say there's anything wrong with Prisoners. But personally, it's the soul and the nuance that's in his other films that takes them a step above this one, just slightly. Sicario is about an FBI agent named Kate Macer who's assigned by the government to join a task force for the war on drugs happening in Mexico in hopes of taking down a cartel boss. This is a very interesting film for Denis. It's more rooted in reality than a lot of what I'm used to from him, specifically for this era of his career. You don't just go Enemy, then Sicario, then Arrival. That sequence of films just doesn't make sense. You're not allowed to do that. But it's a reminder of how stylized even his most realistic films can be. Sicario is pretty subtle for Denis too. The bleakness of this one creeps up on you way more than it does in something like Prisoners, where the moody rain and Hugh Jackman are screaming in your face about how to feel, or in Incendies where the tragedy hits you like a truck. Sicario isn't necessarily a slow burn, but that feeling of dread is creeping its way up to the surface throughout the film. And when you get confirmation near the end of what's really happening, everything in the film feels emptier. In this case, in a good way. Where he fell short with conveying emptiness in Polytechnique, he succeeds here. Emily Blunt's character, who I at first felt at a distance to, holds this whole thing together, and she delivers, in my opinion, her finest performance, though Devil Wears Prada comes close. You feel how broken she is in the end, and she navigates that paranoia perfectly. Listen, you guys know how much I love revenge films that end up commenting on that tragic cycle of violence. This has one of the coolest and cleanest examples of a breaking the cycle moment, and I love how much it keeps you on edge without ever being boring. Like, that's something I noticed with Enemy on a rewatch. I expected to love it more, knowing how it ends, but I found it to kind of chug along pretty slowly before arriving at that point. But in Sicario, I was comfortable with the film I thought this was, until it revealed itself as something else, and that's because of how well developed each and every character is, and because of how riveting and nail-biting the action is. That traffic scene is just insane. I'm underselling how disturbing this gets at times too. Josh Brolin's character, specifically as funny as he can be from time to time, gives a pretty unsettling performance here. Also might be one of his best performances, now that I think of it. If every other Denis movie is him infusing a sense of humanity into high-concept ideas, Sicario is using a lack of humanity to say something about the world we live in right now. Dune Part 1 is the beginning of Villeneuve's long-awaited adaptation of Frank Herbert's sci-fi classic Dune. It tells the story of Paul Atreides, a young man born into destiny who must travel to a desert planet to protect his family. With Part 2 coming out just this last year, and with it being met with such critical and financial success, it's kind of hard to look back and remember just how massive Dune Part 1 was, even if it was just a few years ago. It says a lot about how great Dune Part 2 is, but we'll get there. Until this film came out, Dune seemed to be impossible to adapt. The book, as good as it is, was intimidating for that reason before I jumped into it. The world building is extensive, and there's a lot of material that needs to get covered in order for the core plot to hit the way it needs to. David Lynch did his best to adapt the entire story in one film, and because of studio interference and many other factors, it doesn't really land on its feet. And even if people like myself loved 2049 and knew Denis would nail the atmosphere of the story, I was a little doubtful he'd be able to tell this kind of story in a clean, even somewhat accessible way, knowing his minimalist sensibilities. And the thing about Part 1 is it's about as good as it can possibly be, right? Somehow it was better than I thought it could be. Even if there isn't a real intensity to Paul's arc quite yet, even if Chani barely gets any screen time, there's a masterful attention to character in Part 1, in a way that honestly surprised me. Again, as much as I loved 2049, we'll get there in a second, I personally don't go bananas over that one for the character development. It's why Gosling was perfectly casted, he plays this wooden style really well. But in Dune, in the middle of this massive story that requires so much world building, Villeneuve eases you in so gracefully, he makes it comfortable to sit in. He understands that if you can connect to someone, be intrigued by them, his job of explaining what's around them gets a lot easier. Even if they could be watched back to back in one 6-hour period, Part 1 stands apart from 2 in other ways as well. The look of this film is chalkier, it has a much more classical feel compared to the vibrancy of 2, an aspect that to some, myself included, got frustrating from time to time, a little too much brown, a little too much sand. But cinematographer Greg Fraser finds so much variety within this one simple color palette. He does the same thing in The Batman with different shades of gray and black. It sounds uninteresting on paper, but his attention to texture draws you in every single time, especially in Dune Part 1. In short, Dune is an excellent setup for 2, yes, but it's more than that. It's an impressive adaptation of what was previously considered unadaptable, with a sense of scale that few filmmakers these days can handle as gracefully. Blade Runner 2049 is the long-awaited follow-up to Ridley Scott's now classic 1982 Blade Runner. It follows Kay, a replicant who discovers a long-buried secret and then has to track down a former Blade Runner named Rick Deckard. Remember at the top of this video when I mentioned how everyone has a favorite Villeneuve film, the one that resonates with them the most? Why do I feel like 2049 is that film for most people? And it's not hard to see how. 2049 is a very special film, a pretty formative film for me and a lot of other cinephiles who came up in this era. To be in film school when this dropped, man, it was both so damn cool and so tiresome, you couldn't escape it. This has nothing to do with the actual film itself, I just have to mention how big it was, and still is, to really hammer home how it changed the way we all looked at Villeneuve moving forward. Even if 2049 was a box office flop, Villeneuve made a statement with this, that he's the kind of filmmaker who can take the best technology of its time and use it to its fullest advantage. He went somewhere bold and thought-provoking with the material, somewhere, dare I say, provocative with it, putting it in the same conversations as the original film, which is quite a feat. 2049 is incredibly existential. It's, in my opinion, the most forwardly philosophical work Denis has made so far. It asks big questions like what does it mean to live? Why were we put here? Where is society heading? Big, ambiguous questions that when I bring them up now, I kind of cringe at myself, but 2049 does them justice. The visuals of the film are as sprawling as the questions it asks the audience. It's no wonder this is the film that finally got Roger Deakins his long overdue Oscar win. The cinematography and VFX, and I don't say this lightly, are as monumental as 2001. Speaking strictly about the cinematography, it's the only film I can think of that can go toe-to-toe with 2001. Which says a lot. Deep, rich color palettes, long, empty hallways, crispy shadows. I could look at this film all day. It's captivating. The script is great, the film is really interesting and does work on its own, but the cinematography was talked about at length for like 3 years straight for a reason. Listen, anytime I say you have to see it to believe it, it does sound like a cop-out, but Blade Runner 2049 is just one of those movies. Off spectacle alone, it'll be remembered for a long time. Incendie is Villeneuve's fourth film, his second with actor Maxime Gaudet. It tells the story of two twins who, after their mother dies, are tasked with delivering two letters, one to their father they never met, and the other to their brother they never met. They each travel to the Middle East to an unnamed Levantine country, and in the process learn about their mother's backstory. The film is based on a play by Wajdi Mouawad under the same name. The film is loosely based on parts of Suha Bekkara's time in prison, and although the film is also based on events that happened during the Lebanese Civil War, the filmmakers chose to keep the location in the film ambiguous, an interesting choice I'll unpack in a second. It also, according to Villeneuve himself, is the first film where he really started to understand his own voice. It was a return to filmmaking for him and a deeply meaningful part of his filmography. He even goes as far to say that when he was scouting for the film, he was finding locations that didn't fit for this, but would work for that sci-fi movie that I'm dreaming to do one day. Well, it's a pretty formative film for him in a number of ways, if you can't tell. It's also one of the most devastating movies I've ever seen. By the way, I had to take a walk After finishing this, I do not go on walks. So what does that say? I don't mean for this to sound like a dig at Denis, but he doesn't tend to get these intense emotional reactions out of me. Even these last two remaining films, I felt a sense of fulfillment and excitement. I've been unsettled by his films before, sure, disturbed sometimes, but Incendies left me completely shattered. Obviously a lot of this can be owed to the play, but I've seen Villeneuve maneuver sensitive subjects before. It can be hit or miss. Incendies is not a case of that. This is the most character-driven story he's made so far, still, and he handles it very carefully and with the utmost empathy. Cultural identity is a common theme in his early work, and he explores that theme pretty interestingly here. Again, the country they travel to is never really described. It's just a vague Middle Eastern country, and as questionable as that choice may read on the surface, I think it adds a foggy disconnect to the viewer that the characters in the film feel too. Their background is as mysterious to them as it is to us in a way. I can't know why specifically Villeneuve chose to tell it this way, but I think it adds to the film. Another common theme of his is birth and having children, generational trauma, a way of looking at the film that softens its impact in the end. There is the slightest bit of optimism in how he explores breaking the cycle and building a better future, something he also explored in Sicario. It's moments like this that make Villeneuve's work a lot more nuanced than they may appear on the surface. He commits to his moods so intensely, it's often difficult to notice the lightness you leave his films with. His stories may be bleak, but he believes in humanity. Even if it takes a horrific tragedy to get there, he still acknowledges this belief in Incendies. Arrival, the first Denis film that I saw personally, tells the story of a linguistics professor who is recruited by the government when a series of mysterious spaceships land on Earth. She's tasked with finding a way to communicate with whoever is on these ships before a global war breaks out. It's based on the 1998 novella Story of Your Life by Ted Chiang, and it was Villeneuve's first dip into science fiction, something he has clearly been running wild with ever since. Arrival was a pretty huge success at the time, being, I'm pretty sure, his first film to win any Academy Award, taking Best Sound Design, which it totally deserved. The sound in this thing is pretty special, but damn, only solidifies my belief that Villeneuve did something to piss off someone at the Academy. They nominate him all the time, but he rarely gets any wins. The cinematography here is breathtaking as always, but what really stands out to me are the VFX, which are so simple yet believable. They really capture just how ominous this entire event is. Amy Adams delivers one of her best performances in this. Jeremy Renner's comic relief is, to be completely honest, the reason this went from the top spot to number 2. Only half kidding. Something I have to mention is that Arrival stands apart from the films it would likely inspire. It is, in some ways, a puzzle movie, a deadly term that I throw around pretty often that refers to a trend of films in the current era where the films are made out to be solved in hopes of blowing your mind with a crazy twist. A twist most people will need explained in ending explained videos on YouTube. These films can be fun, but they're limiting. They wear off fast. Arrival could be misinterpreted as one of the big boys from this subgenre, but what keeps it afloat, what keeps me coming back for more, is the soul at the center of it, and its hopeful worldview that by the end is life-affirming. Arrival is more than anything a love letter to time and our limitations as a species. Throughout the film, a series of breakthroughs are made that reveal how this species of aliens lives differently from us, how they interact with time, and through that, the main character makes breakthroughs with her own life, a new tool that's both a blessing and a curse. In it being a curse, I read the film as an embracement of what we don't know, that it's the curiosities of life, the unknown, that keeps us fulfilled, that make life worth living. There's so much tragedy in Arrival. It's a deeply upsetting film by the end, which might be easy to lose sight of within the mindfuckery of it all. But again, as usual, Villeneuve has a really beautiful and optimistic view on humanity that lands this on its feet. Maybe a stretch, but I also kind of read the film as a love letter to multiculturalism. The more you learn, the more you understand time and where we're heading as a species. It explores these broad ideas through really some of the most clever and breathtaking science fiction storytelling I've ever seen. If nothing else, this is one of Villeneuve's most clever and optimistic films, hands down. Denis' latest film, Dune Part 2, follows Paul Atreides and Chani as they unite with the Fremen to protect the universe. It's a big, epic sci-fi blockbuster that, when it came out, felt like a pretty significant moment, not only for Denis, but for cinema. To see a sci-fi project with this kind of muscle behind it, that had the best resources possible, that also happened to be deeply personal for the filmmaker, arguably a lifelong passion project for him, it was special. I had been recovering from knee surgery when it came out and hadn't left my home or even the couch for a week To experience this in a packed IMAX theater with a very attentive and engaged audience felt to me like a thing from the past, a rarity. I was touched by the experience alone. The film itself, another beast entirely. It could just be award season talking points, but Villeneuve has said many times that Dune is something he's been wanting to make his entire life. And you can see that in the film. Every piece of Dune can be seen in the films that came before it, from the grounded performances in Incendies to the bizarre surrealism of Maelstrom and Enemy, from the use of world building in 2049 to the existentialist themes in Arrival. Everything he spent his life in film mastering is on full display in Dune Part 2. Call it recency bias, but it's been almost a year, to be fair, and no film of his gets me going the way this one does. It's the only film of his that, to be honest, I want to rewatch over and over again. What I find special about Dune is how smoothly it plays with your emotions. It's not a challenging film at all, its accessibility is part of the appeal, but it definitely forces the viewer into uncomfortable territory. The main character becomes increasingly dangerous and unstable throughout. Not to spoil. If you haven't read the book, you don't really see Paul's transformation going where it goes, and before seeing it, I was extremely curious to see how Villeneuve would navigate that transition. But we've seen how he's dealt with characters who crossed lines before, in Sicario, in Enemy, in Maelstrom. Again, he has at this point mastered communicating inner turmoil on screen. And yet, despite him obviously succeeding at that transition in the film, he also happens to do it in a way that still surprised me, despite knowing it was coming. Every scene in Part 2 is dealt with a level of urgency that translates clear as day to the viewer. Perhaps what surprised me the most about Part 2 was the amount of personality in it. Not that Villeneuve lacked it before, he has a clear vision, but because of the material in his films, he's often felt trapped and unable to break out of certain tones. Not a lot of room for silliness in something like Incendies, I gotta say. But Dune, being as massive as it is, as deeply rooted in humanity as it is, gives him this opportunity to work with a variety of tones, and he does so seamlessly, not just in comic relief with Javier Bardem's character, but with deeply romantic moments, nail-bitingly tense action, and whatever is going on with Austin Butler. That's on some Panos Cosmatos shit. Dune Part 2 is a rich film, rich with meaning, character, mood, emotion. It's everything I wanted out of this and more. In many ways, I really do see it as Denis' magnum opus. And that is my ranking. You might be sitting here like, this fucking idiot doing it number one. Who does he think he is? I know the Maelstrom fan base is gonna eat me alive for this one, but that's what makes Villeneuve such a fun filmmaker, right? There's a film of his for everyone. I'd love to know which is your favorite in the comments down below right now. Thanks for watching. Go watch a Denis Villeneuve film and form your own opinion. And before you head out, I want to thank this week's sponsor, Squarespace, the all-in-one website platform for entrepreneurs to stand out and succeed online. Squarespace has recently introduced Design Intelligence, which combines 2 decades of industry-leading design expertise with cutting-edge AI technology to unlock your strongest creative potential. Design Intelligence makes it so that anyone can build a beautiful, more personalized website tailored to their unique needs. Squarespace makes it super easy to connect major social and multimedia accounts in just a few clicks, as icons, direct links, or embedded feeds. You're able to build visitor trust while updating content only where you need it, extending your brand's footprint. That also makes it so that sellers can also sync their product catalog directly with Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and Google. Squarespace also makes it super easy to sell access to content on your websites, like online courses, blogs, videos, and memberships. You can earn recurring revenue by gating your content behind a paywall. Simply set the price and choose whether to charge a one-time fee or subscription for access. Head to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Karsten to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain.